Hello students, welcome to the lecture on global competitiveness, and after this lecture we will be able to learn the following objectives. Understand globalization and competitiveness, study the concept of global competitiveness, analyze the indicators of global competitiveness, study the useful concept for measurement of global competitiveness. Let's start with the globalized world, which is the concept of the competitiveness has gained and has been gaining an unprecedented importance in the recent years. After 1970s, there occurred an increase in foreign direct investment of the countries, causing a change in the business segment of the firms. Before 1970s, the activities of the firms were concentrated on the manufacturing sector with the primary products. However, during and after 1970s, the activities of the firm gave its place to technology-intensive manufacturing and services sector. Therefore, 1970s can be regarded as a turning point in the view of globalization. Furthermore, during 1980s, many developing countries started to be more liberal in their economic policies. Privatization, increasing market economy, financial liberalization, and the attempts of the countries for the articulation to the world economy existed in these countries started to be in great demand.
The world is becoming more and more interconnected. Never before in human history has there existed such an intense relationship between international trade, communication, and politics. The term globalization is all around us, sometimes as an opportunity, sometimes as a new challenge. But what exactly does globalization mean, and what are its ramifications? Even though the term globalization is frequently used, it is not easy to define. One thing is clear. In today's world, economic, environmental, social, and political issues and problems are no longer limited to the national level because the world has become so interdependent. Reasonable governance can only be realized within broader groups of stakeholders. For example, state confederations such as the European Union, regional economic organizations like the OECD, or the whole world. Today, modern communication technology and mass media like radio, TV, phones, or internet are global standard. This means that information can be distributed worldwide in real time at affordable prices.
Then developing countries began to be more connected to each other, which brought increasing competition in the world. Owing to these changes observed in the world economy, firms in the developed and developing countries became more efficient and they became as a serious rival at the international markets. All these developments and changes gave rise to the increased volume of trade in the world and paved the way for accelerating competitiveness and prevailing globalization. In this regard, the concept of international competition power gained importance in the world. This implies that in general, international competition power is explained as a share of trade volume in the world trade that is a country owned. In the matter of competition power or competitiveness of a country, competitiveness is defined as the ability of a country to produce goods and services that meet the test of the international markets and simultaneously to maintain and expand the real income and also raise the welfare level of its citizens. However, the concept of competition power should not be totally explained by only the ability of a country's productivity. It should also be explained by the firm level competition power and the industrial level competition power. National competitiveness, as the catchphrase in the global world, refers to a country's ability to create, produce, distribute, and service products in the international trade while earning rising returns on its resources. Although there are different criteria in determining the national competitiveness of the countries, competitiveness is substantially related with the productivity growth of the countries, both at the macro and micro level. Did you know? Innovation is synonymous with risk-taking, and organizations that create revolutionary products or technologies take on the greatest risk because they create new markets. The concept of international competitiveness is often used in analyzing countries' macroeconomic performance. It compares for a country and its trading partners a number of salient economic features that can help explain international trade trends. This concept encompasses, first of all, qualitative factors or factors that do not lend themselves readily to quantification. Thus, capacity for technological innovation, degree of product specialization, the quality of the products involved, or the value of after-sales service are all factors that may influence a country's trade performance favorably. Likewise, high rates of productivity growth are often sought as a way of strengthening competitiveness. But it is not necessarily the case that favorable structural factors of this sort will give rise to increased sales on foreign markets. They may instead show up as improving terms of trade brought about through exchange rate appreciation while leaving export performance broadly unchanged. It is for this reason, as well as because these factors are hard to measure in quantitative terms, that consideration here is confined to a more restricted notion of relative competitive position, namely that related to international cost or price differentials, or more precisely to changes in such relative measures. A first type of indicator that is sometimes calculated relates to producer prices of manufactures. In principle, they measure the prices of goods that are tradable on both home and foreign markets. However, the indices published vary in quality across countries. Their movements tend to be heavily influenced by changes in the prices of intermediate inputs, and above all, the lack of homogeneity in terms of weighting and coverage makes them unreliable. Relative indicators derived from consumer prices also exist, but these have the drawback of including a whole range of goods and services that are not subject to international competition. Moreover, their components and methods of calculation and weighting also varies from country to country. They are nonetheless often used since consumer price statistics are readily available for a large number of countries. For the same reason, relative indicators based on GDP deflators are sometimes used. Indicators for the manufacturing sector that are comparable for a reasonably large number of countries include average export until value indices, and it is these indicators that are the most frequently used. Their particular advantage is that the data relate to goods recorded by the custom authorities as having left the national territory and are representative of goods actually competing on foreign markets. On the other hand, these indices exclude potentially exportable goods, which can be a problem since account may not be taken of possible losses of competitiveness in respect of goods which, while potentially exportable, have not been exported so far because they are too highly priced. Thus, these unit values do not take account of the effects on competitiveness of changes in profitability in the exporting industries. Enterprises may be prepared in the short term to squeeze their profit margins on sales abroad in order to maintain their market shares, but such situations are unlikely to persist for. Should margins be squeezed over long, this would alter some of the determinants of structural competitiveness, leading to an eventual reallocation of resources to non-traded sector. In addition, for a number of homogeneous goods, prices tend to be determined at world level rather than by each producer independently. This being so, or the differences in cost competitiveness will serve as an indicator of changes in countries' relative competitive position. It is thus generally necessary to use both labor costs and export prices when assessing changes in competitive position. Because of problems of international consistency of data, it is usual to take indices of unit labor costs rather than total costs. Labor costs are obviously only one component of total cost, but broader cost measures are difficult to construct and may not yield superior information. The cost of raw material inputs, for instance, may be relatively homogeneous across countries, since their prices are generally determined at world level. Moreover, major problems have been encountered in compiling data on the cost of capital or other inputs that are reliable and comparable across a sufficient number of countries. Unit labor costs in manufacturing rather than the economy as a whole are generally used as being more representative of unit labor costs in the competitive sector, where costs are often lower than the average for the whole economy. With increasing competition in the world, there is a growing interest in the competitiveness strategy. Political leaders, businessmen, and media members all believe to have an idea about what competitiveness is. They also put forward popular strategies related to the competitiveness issue. On the other hand, the organization and researchers who try to define the competitiveness and develop proper metrics for measuring the competitive power. However, the term is still ambiguous. Ongoing discussion tried to build a proper framework that helps to investigate competitiveness. The starting point of debate is closely related to the increasing number of researchers that investigate the relationship between competitiveness and the technology's capabilities. Researchers such as Fagerberg, Kaldor, Porter, Lowell, OECD, and Vic Naraja argue against the other researchers who are still trying to define competitiveness with solely price-related factors, and furthermore highlight the importance of non-price-based factors, especially the technology factor. These discussions have led the revision of traditional views, perspectives behind the competitiveness issue. Before introducing different perspectives of competitiveness, the dictionary definition of competition are stated initially. The first definition is from Oxford Dictionary and the second one is from Webster. The action of endeavoring to gain what another endeavors to gain at the same time. The striving of two or more for the same object, rivalry, now largely used in connection with competitive examination. Commerce, rivalry in the market, striving for custom between those who have the same commodities to dispose of. The effort of two or more parties acting independently to secure the business of a third party by offering the most favorable terms. Active demand by two or more organisms or kinds of organism for some environmental resource in short supply. There are two different classical perspectives that try to define competitiveness. In general, macroeconomic perspective is known as the perspective that identifies what international competitiveness is in terms of price-based factors. On the other hand, microeconomic perspective tries to identify firm-level competitiveness with non-price-based factors investigating rivalry among companies. Broadly, a microeconomic perspective deals with internal and external balance at the country level and focuses on the effect of price-based factors to the competition. A microeconomic perspective basically deals with a firm's internal dynamics that make a firm strong or weak. Nelson. Generally, global competition is defined under the traditional macroeconomic perspective in the literature. The aims of macroeconomic policy are usually described as the achievement of simultaneous internal and external balance in the short run and of as rapid a growth of living standard as possible in the long run. Internal balance is commonly defined as the lowest possible rate of unemployment consistent with an acceptable rate of inflation, for simplicity called full employment, and external balance as some desirable level of the current account, for simplicity equated with current account equilibrium. The desirable degree of international competitiveness in this context could be defined as the level of the real exchange rate, which in conjunction with appropriate domestic policies ensured internal and broadly defined external balance. In this approach, competition in the short run is handled with real exchange rate, and relative price and cost indices are generally used in the studies in computing the exchange rates, which Naraja cordon. As a proxy, the domestic ratio of non-tradable to tradable prices is preferred. At this point, Bolto does not only state the shortcomings of this proxy but also suggests other alternative proxies. According to his research, the domestic ratio of non-tradable to tradable prices has failed in part due to hardly available data. The next suggested one, relative price or cost indices, are insufficient due to their highly dependence on the non-traded goods and services, and finally relative import or export prices are eliminated since they ignore trade potential and seem only relevant to markets in differentiated products. According to his research, the relative cost indicators, namely relative unit labor cost, can overcome these problems and represent the international competitiveness in the short run. In fact, no matter which metric is preferred or criticized as a proxy for real exchange rate, the issue is a common characteristic of all these accepted or rejected proxies: price and or cost base. This issue highlights the mostly debated shortcoming of the macroeconomic perspective. As Wignaraja and Fagerberg mentioned, the main drawback is the equation of international competitiveness only with indicators of relative prices or unit costs. Absence of non-price factor is a too simplified view, as the empirical studies have also suggested. Porter also highlights this drawback. He mentioned that this is a narrow scope for the public policy. The assumption that the markets are sufficiently competitive and the firms are efficient and they do not have any technological constraint that can affect their competitive power constitute another drawback of the macroeconomic perspective. Furthermore, this enhanced perspective is depicted as the origin of the global competitiveness. Both traditional macroeconomic perspective and macroeconomic perspective omit the effect of technological growth and capabilities on competitiveness. In fact, there is a strong positive relationship between technology factor and competitiveness as supported by various researchers. Consequently, both of these views have been enhanced in the last decades, and the technology factor has been defined as the main driver of the competitive advantage. Competitiveness can be treated at two different levels. Firm level competitiveness. Many researchers treat the firm level competition as the origin of nation competition. In other words, nations are as strong as their companies are. Therefore, the key point lies behind the firm level competitiveness. Porter's popular diamond model is also developed based on this approach. In recent years, the technological abilities such as abilities of importing, learning and producing technology together with efficient industrial capacity have become the origin of the competitive power of the nation. A definition of competition would not be complete in the absence of the technology factor. The definition suggested by Department of Trade and Industry (DTI) and Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD), which are stated below respectively, both highlight the importance of the technological factor. International competitiveness has also been discussed during the past decades. There appears to be no agreement on what international competitiveness means. As Krugman mentions, majority of the people think that it is the view that nations compete for world markets in the same way that corporations do, that a nation which fails to match other nation in productivity or technology will face the same kind of crisis as a company that cannot match the cost of products of its rivals. Law criticizes approaches which define national competitiveness as a sum of the efficiency of firms, thus omitting the synergy generated. Think over it. Do you feel the strategies mentioned above will be useful in all contexts? Anyways, companies and countries are becoming more interested in determining their competitiveness relative to their competitors. Therefore, competitiveness should be translated into tangible metrics that allow companies to rank their countries and compare with others. Based on these metrics, generally referred to as indicators, the policy makers and decision makers try to determine the best policies which might serve as a remedy to overcome their deficiencies. Therefore, the researcher tried to determine the indicators and composite measures that can best represent the competitiveness of the companies or the countries. There are two well-known indices used for ranking the countries, which are called as the Swiss Competitiveness Indices. Global Competitiveness Index is developed by World Economic Forum (WEF), and Competitiveness Scoreboard is developed by the International Institute for Management Development (IMD). Rankings based on the former index are published as the Global Competitiveness. report, and those based on the latter are published as a World Competitiveness Yearbook. DTI releases a competitiveness indicators report in order to benchmark UK's economic performance against its competitors. This report was first published as Competitiveness Indicators. Its second edition was published, and finally it is updated and published under a more comprehensive title, Productivity and Competitiveness Indicators. The last report grouped the indicators under 5 productivity drivers, namely investment, innovation, skills, enterprise, and competitive markets. In addition to these 5 groups, the general indicators that represent the overall life standards are also grouped under the title results. The information contained in these reports is treated as a valuable resource necessary for upgrading UK's competitiveness. Can any one of you explain how is Nokia's growth proceeding in the market? Does anyone have any idea on this? Vignoraja and Taylor developed an alternative metric, Manufacture Export Competitiveness Index (MECI). This metric is composed of 3 components: manufactured export value per capita last year, average manufacture export growth per annum last 10 years, technology intensive manufacture export as percentage of total merchandise export in last year. In other words, this metric incorporates the current position of a developing country in export market, the long-term export growth that led to this position, and the extent to which the developing country's exports are technology intensive. Fagerberg first discusses RULC and then states the importance of technological level of a country and ability of delivery on the international competitiveness. In his study, he defines the growth in technological competitiveness as the major factor behind the delivery ability. Therefore, 2 indicators, namely technological level and growth in technological competitiveness, are introduced. These indicators are defined based on 2 sources, technology input and technology output. In an increasingly integrated and global economy, the objective is to ensure that all 10 Cs are at levels that meet or surpass industry benchmarks. Similar to the podium's philosophy that guided Canada's 2010 winners Olympic and Paralympic efforts, there is really only one standard in the 10 Cs world, and that is the global standard. Price, quality, commercial and delivery terms, customer service support, the list goes on, are all component parts of a buying decision. Whether a company is selling goods or services domestically or to clients abroad, they must have a clearly defined value proposition that meets or exceeds their customers' requirements. Canada is a nation of small and medium-sized enterprises. Of the approximately 1.1 million employee businesses in this country, over 99% are small and medium-sized enterprises. In this case, commitment refers to the demonstrated commitment by management and employees in planning for and implementing commercial activities. Availability of and access to capital is a critical element in building a healthy and viable enterprise. Connected in this case has 2 component parts: business connection, networks, IT readiness or connectedness. Building a globally competitive enterprise requires both. Competitiveness is defined as a set of institutions, policies and factors that determine the level of productivity, which in turn affects the rate of return on investment and rate of output growth. Within this context, a competitive economy is more likely to achieve rapid growth over time. Researchers use the following concept to measure global competitiveness. Pillar 1, institution, legal and administration framework within which individual, firms and governments interest to generate wealth. Pillar 2, infrastructure, effective modes of transportation and communication including quality, roads, railroads, ports, airports, utility, supplies and telecommunication networks. Pillar 3, macroeconomic environment, stability and predictability in economic activity based on optimal levels of regulation and taxation for private firms to create employment, manage production and make profit. Now in the end, let us summarize what we have learned in this lecture. Competitiveness, relationship between globalization and competitiveness, concept and various definition, indicators of competitiveness index and competitiveness scoreboard, UK competitiveness indicators, manufactured export competitiveness index, technology index, concept of trade overlap, export similarity, standardized trade balance, C's of global competitiveness, competitive products and services, critical mass, capital, measuring global competitiveness, institution, macroeconomic, environment, health and primary education.